already skittish wolves were even more nervous now. At least my bravado worked on them. If Brittany had been harmed in any way, my fists clenched, aching to hold the smooth leather grip of my swords. My muscles almost twitching to swing the steel weight, cleave flesh. The fury and anger burned and seethed. The air around me crackled with it. "Alex, have you come to surrender?" Thornton asked me. The smirk around his lips told me he'd seen through my act. He knew he held my heart. "Have you?" I shot back, forcing a calming breath through my teeth. I knew this wasn't going anywhere. Cocky as ever. "I never did like that about you, boy," the European Regis said. "I'm going to enjoy breaking that pretty little spirit of hers. She screams so wonderfully." I heard Samuel's scream of warning, but didn't heed it as I darted across the lawn, my swords already in my hands, although I had no conscious memory of drawing them. I swung one black blade in a downward slash, cutting through the air with a whistling sound, right where Thornton's throat had been a mere fraction of a second before. Continuing my momentum, I swung my second blade upward, cleaving open one of the vamp's belly, spilling entrails across the steps. My first blade sweeping out horizontally to decapitate the poor guy before he could even remotely start to regenerate. Growling told me Jaden had charged and was now fighting with more of Thornton's shifters behind me. Ignoring that, I turned to attack the others that had been guarding my fellow Regis. The witch was gone, and so was Thornton. So it was obvious that had been some sort of teleporter that he'd ordered to get him out as soon as I charged. Not all that strange. I knew the vampire was a coward at heart. He'd stab me in the back as soon as I left it unguarded. As I turned on the second vampire, he dodged a few of my swings, and we spun around each other even as the third tried to stab me when he had an opening. It was clear the two were used to fighting together as they flowed smoothly from combat stance to combat stance without hindering each other. As I ducked and rolled away from a blow from a huge pole axe, I swung one sword up in the air, sending it in a spinning arc. My empty hand. I turned to the axe-wielding guy, and with my powers he soon burst into flames, the red tongues licking across his skin like a lover's caress. I caught my sword by its handle again as it fell back from the sky, just in time to spin around and carve a slash across the last vampire's chest, using my second blade to finish him off with a decapitating swipe. Too easy. Way too easy. My blood was roaring for more violence. I needed to get to Britt, and I needed to punish those that had hurt her. This was nowhere near enough to satisfy my hunger for vengeance. Having disabled the enemies in front of me, I made for the door and tried to blast it open with my powers, using my mind only to push the heavy oak apart. When it didn't budge, I used more power, and that created a humming in the air around me, the air whipping my hair against my skin as it spun in wild currents. "Stop. It's..." I heard Samuel yell just as the door did burst apart, from the inside out though. The Viking appeared beside me, his huge black blade drawn just as the vile stench of sulfur poured out of the door, along with a mass of writhing black and red scaly bodies, some even burning or breathing fire. I laughed, a grin splitting my face apart. More opponents? Jog Gobel. And easier. Is that each braze a find actions time. Also, Cobbing Gasada, Nexty Hazantees, and my throat ached from it, while my nostrils burned from the stench. This wasn't the sweet, beautiful human blood, but the vile blood of demons and the sharper blood of shifters. There were vampires who loved this kind of blood, called it more potent, but not me. Sure, I drank from the incredibly strong, powerful blood of Samuel, a Jotun, but he was one of the few I could stand the taste of. There was a lull in the fight. Thornton's men exhausted, the demons nearly all gone, and most of the wolves had scattered. The remaining hostile forces had gathered in and around the house, forming a tight circle, and witches had cast spells to keep us out. It was frustrating, and now that I momentarily had no opponents, I threw back my head to roar in anger. I could care less if that told Thornton how much Brittany meant to me. Anger and rage were a writhing, burning, seething mass inside of me. I couldn't contain it. I had to keep moving. Any progress? Are you getting through their shields? I demanded as I swiveled around to face the crone of the village here. She was a powerful witch, and although I hadn't searched her out before in this life, I knew we'd met on occasion. Her in earlier incarnations of herself, though. She smiled, and her teeth were a little crooked and yellowed. "Yes, we're nearly there. Send in the Dracos, my lord." I turned to yell an order at Lysander, but the man was already running forward towards the house, completely forgoing cover. As soon as he had gained enough distance on his allies, he shifted, his body mass exploding outward as he changed from a heavily muscled, tall human to a huge, even heavier muscled, black dragon. His scales glittering like obsidian in the flickering light of a sunset, 3 horns proudly on his forehead to announce to the world that he was not just any dragon, he was royalty. He hit the side of the building with all of his body mass, throwing in over 50 tons of weight. It shook the area with a thundering sound, and I felt a spike of worry. If the building collapsed, Brittany would get caught in it, like a ripple on a pond. Ripples rolled outward from where he'd hit the shield and building. They sparked blue and red and yellow and green. A crackling resounded, and then I knew he'd already done it. The shield was gone. With yells of victory, my Gaishiok, my warriors, and my Dawishok present surged forward to renew the attack. We had to beat back Thornton and his son Edward thoroughly, or they'd try this all over again soon. I would not rest until I knew Brittany was safe. To one side, the ground split apart, and I knew the Demon Lord had opened a gateway. More of his minions started pouring into our world, screeching and screaming cries of war and hatred. Most of them small, imps. A lot of them as tall or taller than a human, but only one was as big as Lysander in his dragon form. It was a burning mass of what appeared to be boulders held together by sinewy muscles, no skin whatsoever. The thing barreled into the dragon without pause, and together they tumbled into the building. I screamed in warning, both out loud and mentally, and Lysander scrambled to get up into the air, spreading his large wings shot with silver. However, the damage had been done. Part of the second floor had been torn clean off. Knowing that Lysander would do his best to keep the house intact now that he'd been made aware of the danger, I turned, facing the Demon Lord that I'd now spotted on the other side of the chasm, running. I was there in a flash, dodging past the lesser demons and imps easily, and hamstringing the occasional creature when it crossed my path. The chasm was about as wide as 6 cars together, and sulfuric smoke was billowing out of it. Hell, as humans often called the demon realm, wasn't actually located below the Earth's surface, but their portals always manifested themselves this way. The demon, Brittany's father, saw me coming and started to spin away, smoke swirling around him as he started to dematerialize. I don't think so. I smirked as I propelled myself across the tear in the earth, landing both my feet solidly in his back. We rolled across the ground together, the demon hissing, I was growling. I didn't care that I sounded much like a rabid dog. I was going to tear his throat out. We both got to our feet and I swung my blades, testing the demon's reflexes. He sprung back to avoid the cold bite of my steel blade and raised both his claw-like hands. Fire streamed out of them and engulfed me whole. Burning and seething and scorching, the demon's eyes gleamed in victory. I laughed, the air crackling as the demon's power collided with mine, splitting as if cut with a knife and billowing around me without touching me, passing me without even harming me or my clothing. Fool, I scoffed. I was born in fire. But I knew that sending him my own flames would be useless. He was as immune to fire as I was, although before demon fire and dragon fire had both been able to harm me. It seemed my powers had evolved yet again. Instead, I attacked him with my swords, slowing my strikes just a tad, enough to make him think I was tired, that I'd slowed after the 2 full hours of combat we'd had. If he believed it, he'd underestimate me, and that would definitely be his ending. The demon had an unusual fighting technique, using his claws and dancing into close range as if not the least bit worried that he'd be injured. With one hand, he grabbed my right sword, yanking hard to wrestle it out of my grip. With the other, he slashed for my throat. I dodged the slash just in time and felt adrenaline shoot through my body. Close call. I knew those nails were highly poisonous. With a growl, I blasted him backwards with pure power, slamming him into a nearby tree. The thing broke with a mighty crack, but the demon flowed to his feet with a grace that told me nothing had been broken. Too bad. We circled each other again, and this time, before he could get in closer, I spun one blade in a high upwards arc again, manifesting a serrated throwing blade a fraction of a second later, and tossing it in a fast, blurring arc at the demon. The next moment, I caught my sword again and launched myself at him before he could react. As I knew he would, he dodged the flying throwing blade, and that spun him sideways. One claw out of range to block both my blades now. I let out a growl in victory as my blade hit home. The first one caught by his right-hand claw, and the other caught with his belly. It sunk into the soft tissue greedily, and then caught against the hard spikes of the demon's spine. The demon hissed and then shuddered, red blazing eyes glazing over slowly as he slid off my blade and fell to the ground. The blackest blood stained the earth dark and was corroding my sword, eating away at the metal. I smiled down at his dying form, a momentary sense of satisfaction rushing through my system, only to disappear when I realized I still hadn't found Brittany, that she could be hurt somewhere. With a frown, I focused on our completed bond and tried again to reach her mentally, hoping that, with the death of her father, I'd be able to reach her. A blank wall forced me back, and I threw back my head to growl loudly. Damn it! Where was she? Why couldn't I reach her? Then, before I could move off to the house and tear it apart piece by piece until I had her in my arms again, more demons and imps and wolves and witches appeared and attacked me. I knew my Taoiseach Sakta and other Gaesiak were out there fighting more of them, but where I was the only one. Fighting alone, grinning even though I felt nothing but a horrible need to get to Brit and a terrible vengeance to kill all those that had harmed her. I fell on the new opponents and started tearing them apart, with my blades, my raw power, and even my fangs and bare hands. My gut tightened in anger as I spun around and dispatched of another opponent. Where was that bloody wolf? Where was Thornton or even his son Edward? I needed Brittany, or an opponent that wouldn't die so quickly. Around me I saw that the battlefield, formerly a perfectly maintained and groomed garden, was littered with bodies. Demons and shifters and vampires all piled over each other and scattered about. Jaden was still prowling about, and I could see Seritin flashing around in the shadows, deadly and silent like a viper. I didn't see Samuel anywhere, but I could feel his powers in the air, so I knew he was around somewhere. Throwing back my head, I roared, a challenge to all my opponents. Come out and face me, you cowards. You want my territory? You want my mate? Kill me then. But as I turned and surveyed the area around me, I realized that everyone had fled. At least all the leaders of this bloody attack had. No Thornton or Edward, and even that wolf fort seemed to have disappeared. Well, at least I'd managed to kill the demon. That was a relief for sure. I turned to face the big house and frowned at the complete ruin it had become. Part of the second floor gone, and cracks and tears splitting the building apart. It looked like it had been shaken by a huge earthquake of sorts, and only bits and pieces of it had remained standing. Muted but alive, I could feel the bond between Brittany and me now, although it seemed like it was still impossible to reach her mentally or to locate her. I knew she was breathing, but in pain, and that knowledge made me see red around the edges of my vision. I wanted to kill the demon all over again, because I knew he was responsible for her pain, and I wanted to tear Fort to pieces with my bare hands, because I knew he'd wanted to put his grimy hands on her again. A flash of light caught my eye, and I let out another growl as I realized it was the beautiful wings of light from Telenextic. How did he get into my territory? Like again. I was about to launch myself up into the air with a leap so I could grab the archangel out of the sky, to hell with the consequences, when I noticed the dark shape in his arms. He was carrying something, no someone, two people even. He was flying away to land out on the road, away from what remained of the battlefield. Near the crone, where she stood with a thoughtful, reverent look on her face, even as she cast spell after spell to contain the raging demon the size of a huge dragon. Lysander had it in a chokehold with both his front claws, and he was biting down on a part that appeared to be the demon's throat. Still, the creature struggled. My legs were already moving, breaking out into a run towards them before I'd even given a conscious command to do so. I urged my body to move faster. Telanixtic had dropped his burden to the hard ground gently. One of the people he'd carried, Jennifer. The partly siren girl was covered in grime and dust and even blood, and she staggered when the archangel let go of her, dropping to her knees and shaking with tremors that seemed to be part shock and fear and part exhaustion. Still, her eyes went to the other form on the ground, concern creasing a dust-covered forehead. "Is she all right?" Jennifer asked hoarsely. My attention was on Brittany, her leg at an odd angle, and her clothes much in the same disheveled and grime-covered state as those of Jennifer. She was deathly pale, and blood from a gash above her eye had painted the left side of her face completely red. Her chest was heaving as if she was struggling desperately to breathe properly, the sound painful and labored. I was already on my knees beside her, skimming first one hand up her broken leg, barely touching her but blasting her with power to heal and knit the broken bone. As my hand reached her hip, I felt more bruises that I instantly healed. It also seemed as if many of her muscles had suffered from overexertion, as if her entire body had been put under massive strain. I soothed away those aches wherever I found them without pause. Reaching her chest, I felt a sharp pang of worry shot through me. I couldn't find the reason for her labored and painful breathing. There were bruises on her back, and she'd clearly bit her tongue. But other than that, I healed the gash on her face and the concussion her brain had suffered, and only then did I notice the black stain on her throat, spiraling outward and covering a tiny fraction of the mark. I knew it was the word loyalty that had been damaged, stained with that black. What was that? I tried to remove it with my healing power and found that I couldn't. There was something there, something foreign, magic of some sort. The demons. This was the demons doing for sure. Was this the poisonous effect of the demon's nails? I cursed myself for my lack of knowledge. Fear a tight band around my heart, a different kind of fear. But that was momentarily washed away when my beautiful Brit opened her eyes and smiled. I load it. All right, now host in Creedinga. I load up Alexander. I loved up at Alexander, my mate and the love of my life. He was glorious in ancient Celtic armor, even with the black and red blood that covered him. His eyes were dark and stormy, worried, but they flashed warmly when he noticed my smile. Hey, I croaked to him, trying to reassure him that I was all right. He'd healed me because there was no longer any pain except the burning in my throat. That was the demon's doing, and I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it wasn't fatal. Sitting up, I swayed a little, and with shock, I realized I still couldn't feel Alexander through our bond. Was that fort blocking it still? Alexander bent down further so he could hold me tightly to his chest, breathing out heavily and then breathing in my scent. I'm so glad you're safe again. So was I, of course. But I still felt restless. It wasn't over yet. Someone was still masking my bond with my mate, and it had to be Fort. Where was that bloody wolf? I pressed myself into Alexander's chest, ignoring the hilt of a dagger digging into my stomach. Over his shoulder, I looked around, scanning my surroundings even though one eye was still closed, the dried blood gluing my eyelid to my cheek. One side of my view was partly obscured by Twanic Stick's imposing wings of light. It was a relief to know that he'd come to my aid. The Archangel was trying to hide his own look of relief, but through our faint connection, I could feel it loud and clear. Next to Ia stood Jennifer, and she looked determined and a whole lot scared, but an ancient-looking, wrinkled woman had clasped a withered hand over her shoulder. I was sure it was the only thing that kept her from bolting. That had to be a witch, and maybe even the crone. She looked wise and omniscient. I think she would have scared me too, if not for that warm look on her face. I could see more of Alexander's people as they made a defensive line around where we stood. Yet it appeared the battle was a moot thing now. Lysander, as a huge dragon, was rounding up the last of Thornton's men and an occasional stray wolf from Fort's pack. It appeared these were offered the chance to surrender. Jaden was also there, but he was hardly visible all the way across the field of destruction. In a flash, I thought I saw Seritin, and a beautiful, imposing woman dressed in leather. Samuel was nowhere to be seen, though, but there was enough familiar faces. The Zawisik were taking care of the last remaining demons with ease. All was well now. See that? I told my brain, yet the uneasy feeling in my gut didn't ease, and neither did the pain in my throat. I killed him, Alexander said, his voice betraying nothing of how he felt about that. It made me realize how much I relied on the bond to read him. How much information usually instinctively seeped through to let me know what went on behind his cool and controlled demeanor. Who? I asked, and my voice was incredibly husky and soft. Everyone heard me, though, and I knew they were all wondering the same. That demon loragramogroi, he replied, and this time I could hear his loathing for the creature clearly. My father was dead? I reached up and touched my throat gingerly. Then why did my throat still hurt? Ram, that's what Stephanie called him, I heard myself say. Surprised, I twisted so I could look my mate in the eye. There was a collective silence behind and around me, interrupted only by a fierce roar from Lysander in the distance. Then there was an orange glow as the remains of the mansion burst into flames. Are you certain you heard that right? That was 26 moving in closer. Tension and worry rolling off him in waves, and this time, I think everyone could feel it. Not just me. Alexander's grip around my waist tightened when I nodded slowly. Yes, that's what she said, and he didn't correct her. From somewhere, a handkerchief had been produced, and my mate deftly used it to clean the blood from my face. That means we can't be certain he's dead. Saratin, find me his body. Yes, my lord, the dark man replied softly. I hadn't seen him, but he'd obviously been close by. Alexander pulled me to my feet then and tilted my chin up so he could look at my sore throat. The hissing that escaped him couldn't mean a whole lot of good. Has Samuel been found? I want the cleanup to start now, and as many soldiers as needed return to their posts. The rest remains to guard us here. Scuffling around us, and with my sight restored to both eyes, I could see people around me dart away. The old witchy-looking woman pulled up her sleeves and turned to face the burning house. She was preparing to cast some sort of spell, it seemed. Mumbling softly and frowning as if concentrating intently, Tilenextic and Alexander were the only ones that didn't move, except for a scattering of warriors painted with blue and ochre around us. Obviously, these were the men remaining as our guard. I wondered who'd been responsible for their colorful appearance. Beside me, Deidre moved into my field of vision, clad in black leather and painted just like the warriors around her. Short swords similar to the ones Alexander carried hung in sheaths at her hips, both blades blackened with blood. Her fiery red hair hung in ringlets about her face. It made her look both soft and fierce at the same time. However, her liquid silver eyes were huge, and her face was as pale as snow. She'd come to fight, but something had shook her to her core. Raim, you said? The woman's voice warping the name strangely, as if she was much more aware of the origin of the name and the linguistic cadence that belonged with it. I nodded, my throat burning. Yes, what's wrong? Are you okay? Reaching out a trembling hand, she touched my shoulder. A low, rumbling growl made Alexander's chest vibrate against me, but he cut off the aggressive sound abruptly. Careful, Deidre. I won't be able to control all of my baser instincts right now. She withdrew her hand again, and then leaned heavily on Bob, who'd appeared beside her with an intent look on his face. Raim was the demon that murdered Deidre's family and held her captive before she was made. Shocked, I clutched to Alexander's warmth as I remembered the tragic, horrifying story of the red-headed girl's life. She'd never mentioned the name of the demon when she talked about her past. The demon had come and demanded her hand in marriage. Then, when she and her family had refused, a slaughter had ensued and Deidre had been the only survivor. She'd told me that she'd often wished she'd died then, along with her family. It was hard to reconcile the thought of the man that had fathered me with this monster. Despite the fact that I knew he'd raped my mother and done countless other horrible things. Even despite the fact that he'd hurt me, tortured me almost when I'd been locked up in that basement before. Not to mention what he'd done to Andy. Andy, where's my brother? I asked urgently. That demon wasn't after me. He wanted Andy. Alexander picked up on my fear and spun to bark out orders to the remaining guards, no doubt also communicating mentally with his Dawisash. I had Danis bring him to my stronghold. There he is, completely safe. But I knew before he'd said, if they arrived. Fort, I said. He went for Andy. That's why he's not here. Of all the opponents today, he was the one least missed. I heard Stephanie tell him the demon had another job for him. I recalled the momentary distrust and then the slow-forming glee on his face as he realized what Raim wanted him to do. We were all already on our feet and moving, Alexander slinging me up onto his back, Tilenextic spreading his wings and launching himself into the sky. Bob and Deidre spun around and became blurs as they ran as fast as they could towards the Clitton residence. Alexander, burdened with me, was only a fraction of a second later as he followed them. We arrived at the house in record time, and it was immediately evident that something had happened. The front door was splintered completely, and there were scorch marks on the lawn as if huge fireballs had struck the ground. Alexander cursed loudly in Gaelic. Where is Sarah? Just then, Tilenextic landed. The boy isn't here. I can't feel him. He sounded more worried than I'd ever heard him before, and he wasn't trying to hide that fact at all. As if he'd given in to the more primal urge to protect his offspring. Over here, Deidre yelled, waving her arm as she pointed to a pile of rubble. something that appeared to be the remnants of a garage. The remains of a car were visible just outside of it, smoking, and the prone body of Sarah lay beside the driver's door. She was unconscious, and a wooden stake had been driven through her belly, silver wires glittering across her throat and wrists, bands with runes of magic that forced her immobile. It was clear she'd tried to struggle free, had tried to remove the stake from her body. Just a few feet away from her lay Danis, also unconscious and bleeding heavily. Blood, a dark, already congealing pool around him. Drag marks made it obvious he'd tried to get to Sarah, despite the bloody lacerations and scorch marks that covered him almost from head to toe. Only when we reached him did I see the true horror of what had been done to him, however. His right arm was completely missing. A shimmering shield in front of the stump told us he'd cast a spell to stop the bleeding, only to succumb to the pain and other injuries just before he could reach Sarah and remove the containment bands. Alexander knelt beside Danis after one look at his sister, but he knew he couldn't undo the magic that held her. So he sent his healing powers through the young witch's ravaged body. Danis actually jolted violently with the force of it. He had no heartbeat, Deidre whispered, her face ashen. Were there no guards left here? There were, but a Galamut was with the raiders. Look at the scorch marks. They were overpowered, Bob exclaimed softly. He was pale too, and his voice sounded strained as his eyes darted from Danis to Sarah and back again. Deidre hissed in shock. Galamut? I didn't know what it was, but the red-headed girl seemed to tremble in absolute terror and fear. If that was the reaction to just a name, this creature had to be just as bad as Ryung was, evil. I swallowed back bile in my throat as my heart convulsed painfully. They obviously hadn't had a chance. Color had returned to Danis's face, if only slightly. Yet in response to that, Sarah started to regain consciousness, her arms weakly struggling against the silver bands and blood bubbling up again around the entry wound of the stake. Tonextic was standing beside her, and with sure hands he pulled out the stake in one quick, fluid motion. She screamed, and her legs twitched wildly for a moment. It was clear that the stake had shattered her spine. Alexander was beside her in a flash, blue fire leaping from his hands even before he reached her. It filled the gaping hole in her middle, knitting flesh back together so rapidly that we could see it move. The fire also licked across the silver bands, and soon they sprung apart like locks that popped open. When that happened, it made the sound of breaking twigs. Immediately, Sarah moaned, "Danis?" Despair and intense fear covered her face and drenched her voice. "He'll live," Alexander barked out as he shifted her to stretch out more comfortably on the ground, his movements jerky and ungraceful for once, yet tender all the same as he stroked his sister's face. "I can't feel my legs," she moaned again, in surprise this time. It was clear she'd never experienced anything like this before. At least there was no pain then, and that was a relief. I didn't want to imagine the agony of a stake through your belly. "They are healing, Deifer Oak. It's all right." My mate was smoothing his hands over her face gently now, reassuring her, while Bob knelt on her other side started doing the same, murmuring softly in ancient Gaelic. It looked like something both men had done 1,000 times before when Sarah had been a little child, scared of a nightmare or a shadow beneath her bed. "I'm so sorry." Sarah's eyes found me a little away from her, and they were wide and big and full of sorrow, calmer under the gentling touches. "They took Andy." "E took him." "I know, we'll find him." I tried to sound brave, even though I was shaking on the inside, but I knew it would only upset Sarah now if I showed her my own fear. My friend had been through enough for now, so I'd locked the panic up inside me until I could be alone. "No, they're going to kill him." "I'm so sorry, please forgive me." She then started wailing, as if in intense mental pain, tears rolling down her ash-stained cheeks as if she was already mourning for my brother. "You fought to protect him the best you could. You nearly died. Danis nearly died. What more could you have done?" I said, yet the despair I was feeling myself made my voice sound shrill and my words were laced with fear. Sarah didn't reply but kept wailing in agony even though the stake wound in her middle had nearly closed by now. Alexander wiped his hand over her face in a quick but practiced gesture, and she fell quiet immediately, fast asleep. With a grim look on his face, my mate turned around and gathered me in his arms. "We will find him, Britt. I won't let the demon hurt Andy." I allowed myself a moment to rest in his arms. Then I turned to survey the damage to the house and the area, hoping there would be traces, clues as to where they'd taken my baby brother. All I saw, however, was Dennis's still limp body with his arm missing, and I could no longer keep my feelings inside. Tears burning their way up my throat and forcing their way out from beneath my no-clenched shut eyelids. "Please, somebody help him?" I heard myself whisper, and in reply to that, I heard only the whispering of a set of wings as Alexander tightened his grip around me. Blackness engulfed me, and the last I heard was the lullaby that had rocked me to sleep so many times now. He'd used his power to make me sleep. I felt a momentary surge of both anger and gratefulness. How could he do this when Andy was missing, when my friends needed help? Yet the blackness that engulfed me made me forget, if just for a little while. I woke to the sound of pacing footsteps, but they were distant, and when I slowly opened my eyes, I knew immediately that I was alone. I was lying in a very big, soft bed, surrounded by a very familiar smell. It made me feel safe. Then I frowned, unable to sense Alexander. Someone was still shielding me, blocking me from sensing the people I'd by now become so familiar with. Finding comfort in the tenuous connections between our minds. Even my bond with Talan Extic was now shielded. I could tell the bonds were there though, unlike before. Whoever was doing this had stopped hiding it from me, using the energy instead to make the shield stronger. I tried in vain to find my way around it, anxious to see if I could reach Andy. Was it Fort? And was he really that powerful? In moments, the rest of my memories came rushing back, and I was overwhelmed by a sense of despair. Andy gone, 2 of my best friends gravely injured, and more of Alexander's people dead. How had this been allowed to happen? How was this even possible? Did Alexander really leave Andy so unprotected? With only a handful of warriors, and Sarah, who wasn't the strongest fighter, and Dennis, a witch more capable of teleportation than combat. Anger surged through me at that thought. Could he really have been so stupid? Sitting up, I became aware of the pain in my throat. A moment long, the room spun around me. Then I managed to focus, and I realized I didn't know where I was.